Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hamdan Nuramdani and my partner is Muhammad Dediman Faluti. Today, we are going to present the assessment of knowledge domain, examples, and rubrics. There are 3 points for the outline in our presentation. The first point is the assessment of knowledge domain, and the second rubrics, and the last one is about examples. We are going to talk about the assessment of the knowledge domain. In the teaching learning process, there is an assessment of knowledge. So the question is, what is the assessment of the knowledge domain? Assessment knowledge is an assessment to measure students' knowledge in the form of factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive knowledge and down to high-level thinking skills. Look at the sentence. There are factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive. Based on the previous slide about the definition of assessment knowledge, factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive are types of knowledge. There are 4 types of knowledge. The first is factual knowledge. What is it? Factual knowledge encompasses the basic elements that experts use in communicating about their academic discipline, understanding it, and organizing it systematically. In the type of factual knowledge, there is knowledge of terminology. Knowledge of terminology includes knowledge of specific verbal and non-verbal labels and symbols. For example, knowledge of the alphabet, knowledge of scientific terms, knowledge of the vocabulary of painting, knowledge of important accounting terms, knowledge of the standard representational symbols on maps and charts. And the last example, knowledge of the symbol used to indicate the correct pronunciation of words. In the factual knowledge, there is knowledge of specific details and elements. Knowledge of specific details and elements refers to knowledge of events, locations, people, dates, sources of information, and the like. For example, knowledge of major facts about particular cultures and societies. And the second, knowledge of practical facts important to health, citizenship, and other human needs and concerns. And the last example, knowledge of specific details and elements is knowledge of the more significant names, places, and events in the news. The second type of knowledge is conceptual knowledge. What is it? Conceptual knowledge includes knowledge of categories and classifications and the relationships between and among them. It is more complex, organized knowledge forms. In the conceptual knowledge, there is knowledge of classification and categories. Knowledge of classification and categories includes the specific categories, classes, divisions, and arrangements that are used in different subject matters. For example, knowledge of the variety of types of literature, knowledge of the various forms of business ownership, knowledge of the parts of sentences, like nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Point number 2 in conceptual knowledge is knowledge of principles and generalization. It is principles and generalizations tend to dominate an academic discipline and are used to study phenomena or solve problems in the discipline. For example, knowledge of major generalizations about particular cultures, knowledge of fundamental laws of physics, knowledge of the principles of chemistry that are relevant to life processes and health. And the last knowledge in conceptual knowledge is knowledge of theories, models, and structures. Knowledge of theories, models, and structures includes knowledge of principles and generalizations together with their interrelationship that present a clear, rounded, and systemic view of a complex phenomenon, problem, or subject matter. For example, knowledge of the basic structural organization of the local city government, knowledge of a relatively complete formulation of the theory of evolution. The third type of knowledge is procedural knowledge. What is a procedural knowledge? Procedural knowledge is the knowledge of how to do something. Procedural knowledge often takes the form of a series or sequence of steps to be followed. It includes knowledge of skills, algorithms, techniques, and methods, collectively known as procedures. In the procedural knowledge, there are three knowledge. The first is knowledge of subject-specific skills and algorithms. The example of knowledge of subject-specific skills and algorithm is knowledge of the skills used to determine word meaning based on structural analysis. And the second knowledge in procedural knowledge is knowledge of subject-specific techniques and methods. The example of knowledge of specific technique and method is knowledge of research methods relevant to the social sciences and the knowledge of the techniques used by the scientists in seeking solutions to problems. And the last point in procedural knowledge is knowledge of criteria for determining when to use appropriate procedures. Example of knowledge of criteria for determining when to use appropriate procedure is knowledge of the criteria for determining which of several types of essays to write, such as expository, persuasive. Okay, we move to the last types of knowledge. It is metacognitive knowledge. What is a metacognitive knowledge? Metacognitive knowledge is about cognition in general as well as awareness of and knowledge about one's own cognition. In the types of metacognitive knowledge, there are three knowledge. The first one is strategic knowledge. Strategic knowledge is knowledge of the general strategies for learning, thinking, and problem solving. For example, knowledge of planning strategies such as setting goals for reading. And the second point in metacognitive knowledge is knowledge about cognitive tasks, including appropriate contextual and conditional knowledge. It is knowledge of the types of tests particular teachers administer, knowledge of the cognitive demands of different tasks. For example, knowledge that recall tasks, knowledge that a simple memorization task. And the last knowledge in metacognitive is self-knowledge. What is a self-knowledge? Self-knowledge includes knowledge of one's strength and weakness in relation to cognition and learning. For example, students who know they generally do better on multiple choice tests than on essay tests have some self-knowledge about their test-taking skill. And the second example is knowledge of one's personal interest in a task. Okay, that's all about types of knowledge. We will move to the next slide. There are 6 categories in the cognitive process domains. The first is remember, and the second understand, third apply, and the fourth analyze, 5 evaluate, and the last one is create. We start from the first category. It is remember. Remember includes recognizing and recalling. Recognizing means locating knowledge in long-term memory that is consistent with presented material, such as recognize the dates of important events in the US history. And recalling, in other names, is retrieving relevant knowledge from long-term memory, such as recall the dates of important events in US history. The second category is understand. Understand includes interpreting, exemplifying, classifying, summarizing, inferring, comparing, and explaining. Interpreting means changing from one form of representation to another. For example, such as from numerical to verbal, from paraphrase important speeches and documents. And the second is exemplifying. Exemplifying means finding a specific example or illustration of a concept or principle, such as give examples of various artistic painting styles. And next is classifying. It means determining that something belongs to a category, such as concept or principle, classify, observe, or describe cases of mental disorders. Next, summarizing. Summarizing means abstracting a general theme or major points, such as write a generalizing short summary of the event portrayed on a videotape. Inferring. Inferring means drawing a logical conclusion from presented information, such as in learning a foreign language, infer grammatical principles from examples. And the sixth is comparing. Comparing means detecting correspondences between two ideas, objects, and the like, such as compare historical events to contemporary situations. The last one is explaining. Explaining means constructing a cause and effect model of a system, such as explain the causes of important 18th century events in France. The third category of cognitive process domain is apply. It consists of executing and implementing. Executing is applying a procedure to a familiar task, such as divide one whole number by another whole number, both with multiple digits. And the last, implementing. Implementing means applying a procedure to an unfamiliar task, such as use Newton's second law in situations in which it is appropriate.
And for the categories of activities student to analyze consists of subcategories are differentiating, 2 organizing, and 3 attributing. Differentiating, distinguishing relevant from irrelevant parts or important from unimportant parts of presented material. Example, distinguish between relevant and irrelevant numbers in a mathematical word problem. Organizing, determining how elements fit or function within a structure. Example, structure evidence in a historical description into evidence for and against a particular historical explanation. Attributing, determine a point of view, PS, values, or intent underlying presented material. Example, determine the point of view of the author of an essay in terms of his or her political perspective. And then the categories to evaluate as subcategories. First is checking and the second is critiquing. Checking, detecting inconsistencies or fallacies within a process or product, determining whether a process or product has internal consistency, detecting the effectiveness of a procedure as it is being implemented. Example, determine if a scientist's conclusion follow from observed data. Critiquing, detecting inconsistencies between a product and external criteria, determining whether a product has external consistency, detecting the appropriateness of a procedure for a given problem. Example, judge which of two methods is the best way to solve a given problem. To create has subcategories. First, generating, planning, and producing. Generating, coming up with alternative hypotheses based on criteria. Example, generate hypothesis to account for an observed phenomenon. Planning, devising a procedure for accomplishing some task. Example, plan a research paper on a given historical topic. And the last is producing, inventing a product. Example, build habitats for a specific purpose. Now let's continue our discussion about categories of the cognitive process domain. Some activities that according to the taxonomy domain, and my turn to explain: to analyze, to evaluate, and to create. And the next slide is about taxonomy table for hypotheticals in comparison between taxonomy Bloom's activities with the Ohm's law unit from the cognitive process dimension and the knowledge dimension. Let's see. We see here in the slide taxonomy table for hypothetical Ohm's law units. This is a comparison between the knowledge dimension and then with the activities from the taxonomy Bloom's from the low thinking order, then mid thinking order, and then also the high of thinking skill. We can see that in the cognitive process dimension, from remember and then understand and then apply and then analyze, evaluate and create. And we can see from the table in the knowledge dimension there is a factual knowledge and then conceptual knowledge and procedural knowledge and then the metacognitive knowledge. If the student can do or has ability to remember and understand, this is a low thinking order, so they just only in the factual knowledge dimension. For example, when the student is only remember about using of present tense and then they understand how to use that in the affirmative and then negative and in the other sentence, so they just only in the factual knowledge. And in the part B, when the student can do the activities from remember and then understand and then analyze and then even they can create, so they have ability in the conceptual knowledge. They can remember, for example, they can remember about the present tense use and then they can understand about the present tense using and then they can analyze and even they can create a story or a paragraph using present tense. And after that, in the part C, we can see procedural knowledge, when the student has ability in remember and apply and evaluate, so they know the procedural knowledge. In the last part, like part D, we can see here metacognitive knowledge, when the student or the teacher using assessment or evaluate just only in remember activity and evaluate activity in the learning process. So this is only in the metacognitive knowledge. And then the next part of our discussion about knowledge assessment is rubrics. Rubrics is notes that used by the teacher to get some information of the student activities. And rubrics help teachers how to give scores to the student tasks or student activities in their knowledge. Rubrics are various. It can be a multiple choices questions or it can be a written task that can be done by the student, and it can be also the assignment that given to the student. It can be a discussion sheet that contains question and answer, and it can be analysis sheet if the question consists with different parts between multiple choices or academic writing like essays. As we see here, we can see some types of the rubrics form, and also every school has a different formative rubrics. If we see here, it's about multiple choices rubrics. It consists the answer of the students, and then there is also alternative answers and how to answer or to solve the questions. And then there are also the topic and then the indicator, and then what the questions about, and then the answers. And in these types of multiple choices rubrics, it has a score guidance when how to give the score, even if it is a minimal score or maximal score. And then the next type of the rubrics we can see here is the written task to the students. Even this formative task is combined between multiple choices, but there is a rubrics about the written task. It still informs to us about the topic, and then the indicator, and then what is the answer, and how the student to answer the questions. Then after that, we can use the analysis of assessment between multiple choices that is done by the student and the essays answer, and then we directly can give cognitive score to the students. In this slide, we can see another types to the rubrics, and for this type is assignment that given to the students, as we see here how to identify about a topic, and then what the assignment is, like writing a report or result of experiment, and then the indicator is to make a report of the result in an experiment. And then don't forget to give them a direction or hints to the student about the steps of the assignment, And in the next part is about assessment rubric, how to give them score, whether this is very good, good enough, or not good. As we see here, next types of the rubrics, and this is the types of rubrics is about the observation of discussion among the student, and it absolutely about asking and answering, question and answer between student to others. We can see in the rubrics just only what class is it, and then the name of the students, and then there are some statements, not question but this is statements, how they deliver their idea, and then how about the truth of their concept, and then the effectivity or efficiency of using terms and others for the score. And then knowledge assessment of the discussion. Here we can give directly the score to the student. It started from the name of students, and then we can use or we can sum the score where they doing the statements that we give to them. And this type of the rubrics of analysis is doing some analyzing of the student score between the multiple choices score and then the writing score, and then we can combine from the multiple choices and writing and with the observation. So there are some parts or some techniques in assessment, and then from some activities we can give the student in formative scores. Here are some examples of knowledge assessments rubrics when the teachers using rubrics for evaluate or to give score to the student. So they need to use rubrics, but as I mentioned before that every single school has a different rubrics of knowledge assessment. Now see the difference. I have here an example rubric of knowledge assessment from State Senior High School of One Duku Puntang, SMAN One Duku Puntang, and the school use different sheet from knowledge assessment and psychomotor assessment and effective assessment. So knowledge assessment become part C, or the third sheet for assessment. Before that is spiritual, and then psychomotor or skills, and then the third is knowledge assessment. So in the rubric 3, we can compare examples from a state senior high school and a private vocational high school between SMAN 1 Duku Puntang Cirebon and SMKS Manbaul Ulum Cirebon. Okay, for the assessment knowledge sheet here of vocational high school of Manbaul Ulum, a private school in Cirebon, we can see in a one sheet, but it consists of 3 domain of assessment, from knowledge assessment, and then psychomotor assessment, and effective assessment. So it will be more complete in one sheet. And the next page also same with the above sheet. When it is combined between knowledge assessment and psychomotor assessment and effective assessment in a sheet, and then here a signature from the headmaster and also the teacher. As we see here, the format of rubrics knowledge assessment from SMAN 1 Duku Puntang, and there are some cumulative of the daily assessment. It will show the KD and then how many daily assessment given to the student. It is same with other school. In the part of the end of the sheet assessment, it will be assigned by the headmaster and the teacher of the lesson. And the example of rubric 2, I have here the sheet of score compilation of the student from a state vocational high school. In this compilation of the score, or we call as transcript score, it is just contain the psychomotor score and cognitive score. And for the examination, it will be shown the USBN score, UKK score, and UNBK score. But I think the school or other school has a different format or the content of the transcript score, and then in the end, or in the end of the transcript, here at the bottom of the sheet, there is a signature from headmaster. For the references, we got from Anderson and Cradwell Books 2001, a taxonomy for learning, teaching, and assessing, a revision of Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. Okay, well, this is the end of our presentation. So, is there any questions? Thank you for your attention. See you next time and bye bye.